All right, folks, let's get underway. Thank you all for coming and braving the inclement weather. That's the way educated people say rain. To come out. This is going to be the June monthly update that we do every month. We will not be doing it in July and August, but we will resume in September. Since I see a number of new faces, let me simply remind everyone that the monthly update tries to talk about some of the major changes and developments in the economic situation since last time we met, in this case early in May, and then to focus on a particular topic. We're going to do that again tonight, but we're going to be a little bit briefer on the two major events since last month in order to leave time for me to give you a report of a visit I made 2 weeks ago to Mondragon, Spain, which is a remarkable place with a remarkable experiment in what is basically an alternative to the capitalism that is falling apart around us. So there couldn't be a more important time than now to consider alternatives with their strengths and weaknesses. As the people who took us through the facilities there in Mondragon said over and over again, this is not paradise, this is not a place that has no problems, but we believe we have a much better set of problems to struggle with than you who live in a capitalist environment. And that's basically the way they handle what they have accomplished. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about that because I think it's an important reality of our world. Very hard to get information in any kind of reasonable way here in the United States about it. And so I want to do my part to begin at least to spread the word and to make people available. There is a lot of literature. Internet is full of it. They do a good bit of web work themselves to put forward what they do. So if you become interested, there are ways for you to pursue your interests. It's a question of becoming aware of what it's all about. Two quick things before that. One, last month we had the monthly update, but it was also a book signing purpose meeting. And this is a book that I wrote with a pretty well-known journalist named David Barsamian, who runs something called Alternative Radio. If you're interested, you just Google Alternative Radio, you'll see the nationwide operation he has. He interviewed me, and this is basically a book called Occupy the Economy, Challenging Capitalism. It's a set of 3 interviews at great length with me about the economic situation. If you're at all interested, come up here and look at it. And my colleague Jen Hill, who's over here, has little cards that give you information about the book, and she'll have those available at the end as well. The second announcement is also about a project we're working on, which is, it's called syndication. As many of you know, I have a weekly radio program here in New York on WBAI 99.5 FM in New York City every Saturday at noon. And we are now fortunate in that this is one of the few economic analyses from this perspective that is regularly put out in the United States. And so we are beginning to discover that there are other radio stations around the country that are willing and interested in carrying this program as well. And so we actually have half a dozen of them now, but we're working very hard. By the way, one of them is Peoria, Illinois. I'm very happy to be on the radio in Peoria. I've never set foot in Peoria, but I would like to visit it now and hope that I would meet people who actually have some sense of who I am. What we're looking for help. If you know anybody who works in a community radio station, a listener-supported radio station, a college station, any station, anywhere in the world, that you might give us a name of a person, we can then follow up and present the material as to why it might be useful for them to make use of this program. We basically provide the complete program, all done. All they have to do is broadcast it stick it in a machine, and there it is, because it's all done anyway for WBAI here in New York. So if you have any help like that, any contact, any information, please again see Jen Hill in the back there, that's her hand, and she will be glad to take that information, and then we will pursue that as well. Okay, let's turn then to the economic update for the last month. Welcome, Lisa. Come on in. Two things first before we get into the discussion of Mondragon in Spain. The first has to do with a story that appeared in the New York Times and many other outlets today. And that has to do with the decline in both the wealth and income of average Americans across this crisis from 2007 to the present. It was a front page story in the Times, and it was reproduced and carried all over the place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means and where that leads us, in a sense. The second one, update, has to do with elections that happened since last we met, particularly the elections that happened on the 5th of June in 3 places, in Wisconsin, that you probably know about, but also in the cities of San Diego and San Jose, California, which you might not have learned about, but which really point in the same direction, and I want to talk a little bit about what that involves. So we'll do those two relatively quickly and then turn to Mondragon. Luckily, some friends of mine who are filmmakers have made a film called Shift Change, and we're going to look between the updates and Mondragon as the introduction into Mondragon. We'll turn the lights down. It's a short 8-minute trailer for their film, but it'll set the tone nicely for this discussion of worker-owned, worker-operated enterprises, which is what Mondragon is the world's leading example of at this point historically. So first, the New York Times story this morning. Basically, the story is based on a press release put out by the research department of the Federal Reserve System in Washington. And the Federal Reserve, which watches these kinds of numbers and issues regular monthly reports, had its research team, which is a very big and pretty competent one, do a study of what has happened to the wealth of Americans across the board. How much wealth Americans have, American families, and also to the income of the whole family. Father, mother, whoever in the family works. And the basic numbers are that the wealth of American families from the beginning of or just before the recession hits in 2007 until I believe the numbers go to the end of 2010, dropped by 40%, roughly 40%. Now, there's a simple explanation for that. Most Americans, in case you're not aware of this, have no wealth. That is, they don't have any appreciable amount of wealth beyond their socks, an old radio, a favorite hat, and something in the garage that they can't quite identify. Right? Those Americans who have any wealth, the vast majority of them, have one kind of wealth, and that's it. Their house, their home, their co-op, their condo, or their single-family house, whatever it is. And of course, since this crisis begins with a collapse of the housing market, and housing prices have dropped dramatically and have not come back, that has impacted the wealth of Americans in this disproportionate kind of way, so that you get this number, 40% drop in the wealth. But however you understand the specifics, it is an enormous drop in wealth for people who might have been spending and saving money for a long time to accumulate that kind of wealth, and then in 3 years to see it disappear has all kinds of complicated psychological as well as economic effects. But it turns out that income has also dropped, roughly 7%. That is, families are bringing in 7% less money in the last year than they did in the last year before the recession hit. So let's see. American families have lost 40% on the average. Actually, the numbers they use are the median. That point where 50% do better and 50% do less, well, the median dropped 40% in wealth and 7% in income. Last statistic of interest in the Federal Reserve's report. There's basically been no change in the credit situation of the American people. Americans have not, in general, deleveraged. They haven't stopped borrowing money, probably because they can't. They have been unable to reduce their debts on the whole. So let's put that together. American families, 4 years into a major economic downturn, have lost 40% of the wealth they had, 7% lower income than they earned, and their debts as difficult and as high as they were before. Now the logic. The economy went into the toilet in 2007 because Americans had borrowed more money than their wealth and their income allowed them to carry. They couldn't make the payments. To say that in another way, they didn't have enough wealth or income to keep up with the credit card and the mortgage and the car payments they needed to make. So if the debts haven't come down, but the wealth and the income have, what is the only logical conclusion? That we're in worse economic shape now, going forward, than we have ever been. We have a debt level that we couldn't sustain when our wealth was 40% higher than it is now, and our income was 7% higher than it is now. We're in a very, very bad situation. It's really important to understand. Underneath all the nonsense about recovery, which, by the way, in the last 4 weeks has kind of trailed off. You don't see references to recovery the way you did 2 months ago when it was almost every. That's all gone. That's a reflection of what these numbers show us. You also see in the political world focus on lots of other issues, because this issue is very bad. It is particularly bad for Obama. He's the sitting president. He's going to get blamed for this. Just the way Obama got into office by blaming Bush for the crisis in the first place. But now Obama sits there vulnerable. And of course, Obama made it worse, because earlier this year, he was championing the recovery, associating himself with, see, I brought you a recovery. Yeah, that's a very nice story until it turns down. Then it's, see, and that's what we have right now. It's a gift to Mr. Romney, and it's a problem for Mr. Obama, and it may become a quite serious problem. You're also seeing more stories to try to deflect the problem of the deteriorating economy. And the two big stories are, one, that it's Europe. We're being infected by those terrible things happening in Europe. And second, we're being infected by the slowdown of the economy in China. It is true Europe has terrible economic problems. And it is true that China is slowing down. And it's also true that those things have negative impacts on the United States. All true. But you don't need that to account for what's the matter here. The Federal Reserve statistics do that very nicely, thank you, without the additional negative influence of Europe and China. The slowdown in China is serious. One of the things the Chinese have already done is lower interest rates in order to stimulate their economy and focus new loans by the government on those businesses that specialize in exporting to the United States. That's their strategy to get them out of their difficulty in China. But as more and more cheap things come from China, it makes it even harder for American corporations to compete, which further damages what's happening here. So we're in a situation where almost all the signs point into very serious difficulties. And if you follow the financial press, you will know that most of the major banks and companies that do forecasting have given up their notion, which they had at the beginning of this year, that the second half of 2012 would be a pickup. That's over. Now it's only a discussion, a disagreement on how bad the second half will be, how far it will pull the economy down. No more discussion of recovery. It's now a question of how bad will it get. And obviously, if we're having a presidential election in November, that's a key issue. Now, if I had more time, but I don't want to use it tonight, I would have talked to you, I had actually planned to, about how what the banks are doing and what the government is doing is no solution to any of this. But I'll wait until September All of this will be very pertinent then, just as it is now. For those of you expecting the summer to bring you a hiatus from the economic crisis, do not hold your breath. It's not going to happen. The situation is going to get worse. No one knows how long it'll last or how bad it'll get. But worse it's going to get. It's literally getting worse with each day. But I don't have the time to do that. But it's important that you understand where the direction of economic development now is. Very different from what we were talking about in, say, February or March of this year. Let me turn next to the elections in Wisconsin, San Diego, and San Jose. San Diego and San Jose, California. All took place Tuesday, a week ago, the 5th of June. In the case of Wisconsin, you all probably followed that. It was the effort of the the Democratic Party and the trade unions there, particularly the public employee unions, to win an election to recall the governor, a Republican named Scott Walker. That effort failed, pretty badly failed. At the same time, in San Diego and in San Jose, there were ballot issues up for election that had to do with a number of things, but the key one was proposals to cut the pensions of public employees. Future public employees, people who would be hired, would have to accept as a condition of employment much reduced pension benefits. But very interestingly, it also included in one of the cities, possibly in both, I don't remember, cutting the pensions of existing workers as well. Not just prospective, but existing workers. It's a legal problem to cut the pensions of those who've already retired. They may go to that, but that has more legal problems than what they're doing now. It used to be thought they can cut the future, but not the present. They're breaking that barrier, they're cutting the present. And both those ballot issues in both those California cities passed by big majorities. So you had a major defeat of public employees in the United States, in Wisconsin on the state level, and in these two large California cities at the same time. What is going on, and what's the importance of this? All right, first, what's going on? Just a reminder of the conditions of labor unions in the United States. Once upon a time, labor unions in the United States represented in the private sector as much as 35%, sometimes even more, of employees. Today, unions represent less than 7% of the private sector in the United States. Very important you understand. We're at the end of a 50-year decline, pretty much in a straight line. So that we have less than 7%, over 93% of private employees, people working for a private employer, are not members of a union, do not have a union contract, do not have anyone who bargains collectively for them. That did not happen in the public sector. Over the last 40 years, unionization in the public sector actually went up a little bit. So that today, or up until recently, roughly 30%, of public employees were in a union. Please remember, 93% of private workers have no union, and 2/3, roughly, of public sectors have no union. Anyone who seriously argues that American unions are causing our economic troubles is an idiot. They don't have, it's not that they might not like to, it's not that they might not like to struggle for higher wages and benefits and all of that, but they're too small, they're too scattered, they represent too small a share of the workforce, they don't have the strength. They're barely holding together, in most cases, their capacity to service their members with grievances and all the things that unions do for workers. It's very, very hard for them. They've had to lay off their staffs. You know, a union depends on the money paid by the members as dues. If unions shrink in numbers, that's immediately a catastrophe for the staff and for what they can do. So public employees were the only ones that still had some union representation. What is going on now is the final assault on the labor movement, attacking the only part that remains, which is the public sector. And the attack in Wisconsin, like the attack on the pensions, is partly a reflection that they're already weak, A strong union movement would never have let this happen. They wouldn't have let it come to a vote, let alone lose like this. So what you're seeing is a reflection of their weakness that then makes them weaker. So let's figure out what it means and where it comes from. And the way I'm going to do this is with some history, which is often the best teacher. I'm going to compare what is happening now to workers, in this case public employees, with what happened to American workers in the Great Depression, the last time capitalism fell apart. And let's just remember as we go through that the Great Depression was worse than what we have now. For example, the official unemployment rate in the United States now is said to be 8.5%. It is in fact much higher. But that's the number the government collects. That's the adults looking for work who can't find it. The official count of adults looking for work who couldn't find it in 1933 was 25%, 3 times that. Now, the numbers are not exactly comparable because we counted differently then from the way we count now, but whatever you think of the numbers, that order of magnitude tells you it was worse then. So you would expect that perhaps the bad things happening to workers now, losing pensions, losing benefits, shrinking unions, having the government talk about cutting back here, cutting back there, fewer teachers, fewer this, fewer that, benefits being taken away, jobs less secure, all of the negative things we all experience, you would expect perhaps that it was worse then, since the crisis was worse then. More people unemployed meant they weren't paying taxes, which meant cities, states, and governments were in even bigger fiscal crisis because they had no money coming in. So you might imagine it was worse then. But if you did, you'd be wrong. Stone cold wrong. As wrong as you can get. Why? Because in the Great Depression of the United States of the 1930s, worse than what we have today, not only did workers not stop being in unions, we had the biggest joining of unions in American history. So that's the first difference. Unions weren't attacked. Unions were on the attack. In the 1930s, in the depths of the Depression, an organization was formed by the mine workers union, the leadership, an existing union of miners, formed something called the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. They swept across American industry and organized, in the depths of the Depression, millions of workers who had never been union members before. We've never had a union membership drive so successful in American history before that, and we've never had anything like it since. So the first interesting difference, unions are not being attacked, unions are not being shrunken, unions are not dying. Opposite. Opposite. Next, were people losing their benefits because the government had no money? No. Opposite again. Let's see. 1933 and 4. Roosevelt creates the Social Security system. He announces to the American people, well, it's a terrible depression. Everybody's having a horrible time. No young family can support mama or grandma or grandpa because, you know, there's no money. So not to worry, folks. The government is going to give money to everybody over 65 for the rest of their lives. What? Yes, we created the Social Security system. There was no governmental pension system in the United States before that. Out of nothing came an enormous expansion of government help to people in the depths of a depression. Number 2, Roosevelt, the same year, or the year after, creates the unemployment compensation system in the United States. We never had that before either. Here's what it said. If you lose your job for a reason that's not about your not doing the job, because you screw up or you don't have the skill or whatever. No. If you lose your job because, for example, the company can't sell its products, and so it has no need for you to help make products it can't sell, if you're laid off, we now say, that's not your fault. And, says Roosevelt, from now on, we will do what we never did before. The federal government we'll give you an unemployment compensation every week while you're unemployed for half a year or a year and a half. Okay, let's review. We're going to take care of all the old people, and now we're going to take care of all the unemployed people, or at least an awful lot of them. But he wasn't done. In 1934, he goes on the radio and he makes that famous speech. If the private sector in America either cannot or will not hire the millions of Americans who want to work, then the federal government will do it. And between 1934 and 1941, the federal government created and filled 12.5 million jobs. Now, folks, Social Security is stupefyingly expensive to create out of nothing. Unemployment compensation is stupefyingly expensive, and hiring 12 million people is stupefying squared expensive. But what I want you to understand is in the depths of a worse depression, working people got enormous boosts. Whereas today, they get an enormous shaft. For those of you not familiar with the term shaft, speak to someone else. Find out. Not good. Not good. What's going on? Here is the best answer I can find. In the 1930s, something existed that doesn't exist now. That made certain that even though there was no money because the cities, states, and government had no taxes being paid by all these unemployed people and closed down businesses, there was something going on that made sure, who cares? You're going to take care of the old people, you're going to take care of the unemployed, and you're going to fill the jobs for people and give them a decent job, a decent income, and to feel good about it. That's what you're going to do. Whoa. First thing was this labor movement. An explosion of organized labor. That's different. We're now coming off of a 50-year decline in the labor movement, and it is as weak as the numbers I gave you. In those days, labor was exploding with mass organizations. Second, the labor movement that was so successful was successful in part because it had a very close alliance with a particular set of political movements in the United States who had a name, the Socialist and Communist parties in the United States, who were strong in the 1930s, very strong. Many socialists and communists worked in the CIO. Many members of the CIO were socialists and communists. So the alliance was literally very close and very tight. And that alliance basically approached the business community, the rich, and the government with a kind of 1-2 punch. Went something like this. We are strong unions. If you don't give us a better deal on the job, tell you what we're going to do. We're going to bring our allies, the socialists and the communists, who are coming right down the road behind us, and they are going to make you wish you gave us a deal. Because they're going to make it much harder for you. You know why? Listen to them. They don't like capitalism. We just want a better job. We want better income. We want some help. They are going to take it all away from you. Now, I don't have the time to go through, but they were very clear about this. The unions fought hard. The communists and the socialists made huge demonstrations. You see some of the old photographs of Union Square, the kinds of demonstrations that the socialists and the communists, a few blocks from here, were able to mount. You'll see what New York businessmen and women, or let me change that, businessmen, had to look at in those days. They had to look at people in the street, hundreds of thousands of them. Roosevelt, the president, a politician, then did what good politicians do. He looked at this situation and he said, I got an idea. I'm going to make this work to our advantage. So here's what he did. He went to the business community and the rich, which a Franklin Delano Roosevelt could do because those are his people. Those are his family, his friends, the people he went to Harvard with, all the rest. And he went to them and he said what they already knew. I need to do something for the mass of people to get the union, to at least do what the unions want. Jobs, job security, decent income. Because if I don't, the socialists and communists are going to come. So I give you a good piece of advice, you businessmen and women, you rich people. Give me the money to do it. I know you have it. Give me the money. And here's what I'll do. I will cut a deal with that alliance of unions and socialists and communists. And the deal will be, I'm going to give you what the kind of unions sort of want. Jobs, unemployment insurance, help for the old, what everybody wants. I'm going to give you that. But the deal is you've got to downplay and shut up about that anti-capitalist stuff. Get rid of that. That's the deal. I'll give you a social welfare system, the likes of which you never dreamed of, but you got to get rid of that anti-capitalist noise that you're making. That won't do. The implicit threat was, if you don't do that, we're going to have a civil war here. But that frightened the business community, and he split them. He split the businessmen and women. He split the rich. Half of them went with Roosevelt. The other half hated Roosevelt, hated what he did. And by the way, when he split, Roosevelt did, when he split the business community and the rich, he set back the Republican Party for 50 years. It took him a half a century to come back to where they are now. He really wiped the floor with them. He made the Democratic Party completely overwhelming. He made himself the savior of America. He went to the American people and said, I'm going to take care of the old people, I'm going to take care of the unemployed people, and I'm giving you millions of people jobs. There's no mystery here. He was re-elected president 4 times. No president had ever had that happen before. It freaked the Republicans out so badly that the minute Roosevelt was dead, they went to work to get a law that said no president could have more than 2 terms. They didn't want that ever to happen again. They were defeated. And in that moment, we understand what makes the difference, don't we? The difference in why, in the terrible depression, the American working class got more benefits from the government than they had ever gotten before and than they had ever gotten since, is because they had a powerful alliance between a trade union movement that really rocked the business community and socialists and communists closely allied with them who coordinated their strategies and came right behind them saying, you better give us a better deal or your history, there'll be no more capitalism here. And they meant it. Wow. But in that moment, as is happening so often in history, in that moment of the peak power of the working class, that it never had before and has never had since, Roosevelt also split the working class. Those who had never imagined this could happen looked upon Roosevelt as the greatest thing that had ever happened in America, the savior of American working people. He became a god. He won elections by wild pluralities. That's why he was re-elected 4 times. We never had that before. He was the man who brought everybody a decent benefit. Nobody could fight against him. Nobody could defeat him. But he also got what he asked for from the alliance of unions, socialists, and communists. The socialists and communists stopped talking about the end of capitalism. They celebrated the welfare state. They celebrated what in Europe is called social democracy. They celebrated this capitalism with a human face that took care of old people and unemployed people, that provided jobs, that had all that humanity that had never been seen before. And so the socialism and the communism were downplayed. The Republicans who hated this, the half that he never convinced, went to work to destroy the alliance that had defeated them, that had wrecked their party, and that had changed American capitalism. By the way, when Roosevelt said to them, you have to give me the money, he meant it. How did we pay for Social Security, unemployment, and jobs? We taxed the rich. We taxed corporations. In 1943, corporations paid $1.50 for every dollar that came into the federal government by taxing individuals, businesses had to pay $1.50. Today, the relationship is for every dollar that the federal government gets from individuals, it gets from the business community 25 cents. From $1.50 to 25 cents. That's a change. They won in the last 50 years. They won back what they had lost in the Great Depression. The highest personal income tax bracket for the richest Americans in 1943 was 94%. For every dollar over about 80,000, whatever the cutoff was, if you're rich enough to earn over 80,000, every dollar over 80,000 you earned as an individual, you had to give the government 94 cents. You kept 6 cents. Today, the top income tax bracket is 35%. For every dollar over 150 or 200,000, whatever it is now, the richest people who earn that much, they have to give the government 35 cents. They keep 65 cents. You notice a difference from having to give the government 94 cents to 35 cents? The mass of Americans have had no such tax cut. The Republicans went to work to break the alliance that defeated them. And the way they did that was to attack simultaneously the unions, but most important, the socialists and the communists. They had to be portrayed as disloyal agents of a foreign power. We had to have McCarthyism. We had to have all of those things that happened starting in the 40s and 50s after the war. It had to wait till the war was over because, again, I know some of you don't know this, but during the war, the United States was allied with the Soviet Union. Freaked them all out. American post offices all over America, when you went in to get stamps, there was a picture over the entrance to the post office of Uncle Sam arm in arm with Uncle Joe. Uncle Joe was Joseph Stalin, who was celebrated in America as our warm and fuzzy ally. So you can imagine for Republicans who are already reeling by what had happened, what this all meant to them. So the Republicans destroyed the alliance and thereby rolled back the New Deal, undid all of the... That's why in the crisis today, when we don't have a strong union and we have no socialist or communist party to speak of, we get a different result. The economic crisis doesn't get improvements. It gets further reductions in what is left of after 50 years of decline. And what's the implication? There's only one lesson here. If we want the working class of Americans, which is us, to ever get out of this decline we're in, then the logic is we have to rebuild an alliance like that now. We have to rebuild the union movement, but not a union movement that, I'm going to be a little mean now, has a good alliance with the community. It isn't the community that we need an alliance with. It's with anti-capitalist militants, because that's what did it in the 1930s. And if you don't do that now, if you just have a union alliance with the community, which I guess means the people who live there, you haven't understood. I don't mean to be mean, but there's a part of me that has this message to get across. We have an alliance to rebuild, and we can dance around it all we want. But the historical lesson here is stunning. The elections last Tuesday are a stunning defeat for everyone in this room. The argument made as to why public employees should get lower pensions was the following. Those pensions are expensive. You private sector workers, you're paying the taxes that cover these wonderful pensions for these workers. So if you don't want to be stuck with high taxes, stick it to those other workers. Private sector workers stuck it to the public sector workers. That's not a unified working class. That's not a working class that understands what this means. And here's the irony. The next time the private workers negotiate to get a better deal, they'll be told by their employer, you see the pensions those public sector workers have? It's not very high, so we're going to have to lower yours. Hello? Learn from history or else you're going to be condemned to suffer the consequences. The alliance of the unions, the socialists, and the communists explains the difference between then and now. And if we don't want to have more now, like last Tuesday, that lesson has to be operationalized, or we're looking at a very bad situation. Okay, so much for these updates. I wanted, and I know that had a little bit of bad news in the last little while, so now we're going to have good news. And I really mean that. It is a remarkable story I'm about to tell you. But before we do it, I'm going to ask the lights to go down. Mac's here to help. It's a very short 8 minutes of a film being made here in the United States by Melissa Young. That's Melissa Young there, I believe. About this kind of opera. And it'll be a nice introduction for us into what I'm going to say. So just 8 minutes.
I work here as an employee, but I also own one share of the company. I have a say in what happens with the company, which is awesome.
We have a stake. We have skin in the game, as they say. It's a real business. We have goals to meet, but there's just this environment that we all love what we're doing, and it's very meaningful to us, and we all want it to work.
I have worked at large corporations where there's a huge hierarchy. It takes a lot of energy to operate in an environment like that. We put our energy towards our projects and our products.
Most other companies, I couldn't share in the decision making because I wouldn't have a vote. And at the end of the day, if the work I did produced profit, I wouldn't get to share in that because it would be going somewhere else. If I was concerned about what this was doing to the community, if I worked for another business, that wouldn't matter.
Cualquier empresario del exterior le dirá que lo más importante sea sacar el máximo beneficio. Nosotros decimos que la rentabilidad y el beneficio es importante para sostener a la empresa, pero que también es muy importante la generación de empleo.
We believe that it isn't good for anybody if somebody loses their job. If you lose your job, you haven't got money. If you haven't got money, you can't buy. If you can't buy, you can't buy our product.
El reparto de la riqueza más equitativa llega a más personas y por lo tanto más personas tienen la posibilidad de vivir más o menos bien.
La empresa es nuestra, pero somos trabajadores también, ¿no? Entonces no hay como un jefe que pueda haber en otras empresas, ¿no? Todos somos nuestros jefes y todos tenemos que tirar para adelante con la empresa.
La gran mayoría de las personas se integre más, se envuelva más y por tanto podemos ser más competitivos y competir con la empresa más mejor del mundo. Es el futuro, entendemos, del mundo laboral también.
En aquella sociedad anónima era realmente la sensación de trabajar para otro, acabar la hora y a casa y se acabó. Esto es algo como que forma parte más de nuestra vida, ¿no? Porque tomamos parte desde la cabeza hasta la cola de la organización, ¿no?
Al final que tenemos trabajo, que es muy importante. Muchas veces hay empresas que son capitalistas, si hay un tipo de paro, pues vas a la calle. Habrá unos que salen mal y otros mejor, pero tienes trabajo, no te mandan a la calle.
Ya dejo la caña, pero tranquila, ¿eh?
Soy la segunda generación de una familia cooperativista. Las tres hermanas somos socias en Fagor. Lo han hecho la generación de mis padres, nos lo han dejado en herencia y tenemos que seguir trabajando para dejar esa herencia a nuestros hijos.
companies in this era of capital and job mobility are not really anchored in place. They're not really loyal to the communities in which they reside. And so as companies come and go from our communities, it kind of rips the economic underpinnings.
People losing their homes, the foreclosure crisis here, it's just been devastating. They say you keep doing the same old thing, you get the same results. And people are looking for results right now that's going to make a difference in people's lives.
We give incentives to businesses and they come into a town and they say, well, we're going to move here, and we give them some money, and 10 years when the incentive's over, they say, well, what town should we move to next?
My mama was born in Louisiana, and my daddy's from Tennessee.
This was a unique idea that people would own the business. So the business can't pick up and move unless every single person who worked there said, yeah, we'll move to Florida.
This is a business and we're a co-op. We all have to have a strong mentality that what Evergreen and Ohio Solar is trying to do is going to work for us in our community.
Oh yeah, I work this machine, that machine, that machine. I'll be all over the place. Everybody learns everything, so we kind of rotate and move around. Yeah, you have to. Yeah.
We own this place. That's an extra reason to go to work, you know. Say like it's a house. If you rent it, not so much, but if you own it, you know, that's a big deal.
As you could see, this is a full-length film. You just saw a short trailer. I don't know exactly when it will be done, but it will be done soon, and it will be circulating around the United States in all kinds of places. You should be aware that more and more of this kind of thinking and this kind of work is happening around the world, including here in the United States. It is not getting the kind of attention it ought to, and that's one reason we're doing this tonight. So I'm going to try to fill in, thank you, Max, about it. And again, just to remind you, if you're interested in learning more about this film, if you're interested in helping us with getting syndication for the radio program which talks about this, please talk to Jen over there when we're done. Okay, Mondragon in Spain. First, just some personal words. I spent time there about 2 weeks ago, and they were very kind. They made time for me and 2 other people to really be given a chance to ask every conceivable question we could in their headquarters in the town of Arrasate Mondragon. This is in a part of Spain, in the north of Spain, in a territory where the community is an ethnically separate community called the Basque region, B-A-S-Q-U-E. Most of the Basque people live on the Spanish side of the Pyrenees Mountain, but a good number of them live on the French side, on the north of the Pyrenees Mountain. So the Basque country spans both Spain and France. But this Mondragon is in the Spanish part, and it is really a Spanish experience. It doesn't have a counterpart in the French section of the country. Let me describe to you a little bit and give you some personal impressions and then go into what they've done. This is a mountainous country, not high mountains, but a pretty mountainous part of the world. The mountains are the border between Spain and France and have been for a long time. And the mountains go into the Atlantic Ocean where the French and Spanish can travel to one another because it's flat just by the ocean. From the border with France, it's about an hour and a half by car to drive to Mondragon, and it is in the mountains. It clearly once was a rural area, but now as you travel through it, every time there's a valley, in the base of the valley, there's lots of factories. So it's become an industrialized, slowly, but steadily industrialized area. Mondragon is a small city. I don't know what the population is, but I would guess 100,000, something like that, or maybe more. So it's not a little village or anything like that. This is a real city, looks like a city, and so on. Mondragon itself, very interesting. It begins, its formal date of beginning 1956. 1956. So we're talking about something that's more than half a century old. It was begun in 1956 because this area was desperately poor. A little bit of Spanish history. Spain, before the outbreak of World War II, had a desperately destructive civil war. A civil war in which a popular and democratically elected government was overthrown by a military coup led by a general named Franco. A bitter civil war, 1936 and 7, was fought. Some of you know that groups of supporters of the government there came from all Western countries, including from the United States. Here from the United States, the men and women who went called themselves the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. Some of them still are around. They have an association. They put on shows and stuff from time to time, but they are dying out because of obviously the age involved. But a lot of passionate young people went and fought on the sides of the government there against the military coup. In any case, Hitler and Mussolini helped Franco. France, Soviet Union helped the government, but in the end, the Franco forces won. Tremendous killing, a lot of damage. War was very, very destructive. And then before you could shake a stick, World War II descended. So by the late 40s, when the war was over, you had Spain ripped up by a civil war and then ripped up by the consequences of World War II. And the condition for the people up there was desperate. Mass unemployment, poverty, etc., etc. There's always been also a tension between the Basque people and both the French and Spanish governments over self-government, over the fact that they have a different language, the Basque language. I speak a number of languages. I couldn't understand a word of Basque. It is not like French or German, which I know it has no resemblance that I could identify. Many of the people speak it as their normal daily language. I was in enough villages where I watched people speaking a language that was as foreign to me as some of you may know, languages like Hungarian and Finnish, which are very, very different from the rest of Europe's language. This is a little bit like that. So they had troubles. They were not given benefits from the central government. They had tensions. They sometimes even had military conflict between Basque people who wanted to separate from Spain and France and have their own country. And so it's a long history of tension. So into this poverty and tension and post-war destruction, something happened extraordinary. A local Catholic priest named Arizmendi decided that the way forward would be for workers to set up their own cooperative enterprise. Capitalists were not coming in there with any money to invest. The government wasn't coming in with any money to invest. And so he had the idea, there's always been, for those of you who know something about the Catholic Church, a Catholic worker movement within the Roman Catholic Church. He was evidently part of that. And so he got the idea, let us set up cooperative enterprises in which the workers themselves will provide the money to start it, will own it, will run it, will make all the decisions collectively about their own labor process and what to do with whatever money they make from the operation. Okay? And here's the thing I want to stress perhaps more than anything else. This is not unusual. This kind of thing has happened in virtually every country on earth more than a few times, including the United States. Many examples. But what's really interesting about the one in Mondragon is what happened to it. Because with all the pressures against it, with all the obstacles in its way, it really is a stunning success. Let me give you some just dimension of it. First, it's in existence, so it has survived for over half a century. No mean feat. Most enterprises started in 1956 that were capitalist are not here anymore. So survival is not a minor matter in the history of enterprises. So they've survived. Number two, they currently have 85,000 members. They started with 6. They now have 85,000 members. In addition, they have another 15 to 20,000 employees. I'm going to come back to that because that's a problem, as you'll see a little bit later. The 85,000 members are the owners, operators, and decision makers of this enterprise. Of the 85,000, I thought you might be interested. 43.7% are female. So it's a roughly male-female, roughly equivalent. They have schools and university, big university. They've now currently enrolled 9,282 people in their schools, about 3,500 in the Mondragon University. They include enterprises that are industrial, that manufacture things, enterprises that do banking, enterprises that, for example, they operate the largest chain of supermarkets in that part of Spain. They have high-tech R&D labs. They do a lot of high-tech work. They, in their industry, they sell more outside of Spain than they do inside. They're export-oriented producers. They have important contracts with General Motors to make components of automobiles. They're one of the cutting-edge companies in electronic automobiles, sort of the new kind of hybrid kind of they're big in that. They have expanded. They are now the largest corporation in the Basque territory, either side of the border. They are, depending on how you count, whether you count employees or you count sales, they're between the 7th and 10th largest corporation in Spain. This is a stunning success. By any of the usual standards of 50 years of economic experience, this is a rate of growth, an expansion, a diversification that is stunning. Now let me go back and be a little bit personal with you. I have a rent-a-car because I stay in France. My family's French, so I stay in France. So I drive from the French side of the mountains into Mondragon one morning, 30th of May, Wednesday. And first thing that strikes me as I drive through the city of Mondragon and come upon, with the directions I've been given, this place. The first thing that strikes me is it looks like a modern corporation. On the side of the hill, because these are mountainous areas, on the side of the hill are, you know, your kind of typical rectangular buildings, steel and glass, beautifully landscaped in the front with shrubbery and a little walkway and a lovely place to park your car where there are charming fruit trees growing, and everything is impeccably manicured and clean. And we walk into the building where we are supposed to meet those who are going to come to us, and it's, you know, again, spectacularly clean and shiny, a little fountain in the corner with some leather chairs around where you sit down. The young woman who's a receptionist behind the counter comes out, asks if you'd like some coffee while you wait. The man you're coming to see will be a few minutes. Again, you have this feeling that you're in, well, I'm going to be blunt now. It doesn't look like what a leftist expects to find in any leftist institution, unfortunately. But in any case, it looks like, whoa, this is a well-oiled, well-organized place. And it is. 10 minutes after we sit there, at just the time, 9:30 in the morning, that we were scheduled to begin, a gentleman comes out. He's actually one of the people in the film, with a tie and a jacket, as he had when he greeted us. And he's going to be the man who takes us around. He's going to answer our questions. He's going to show us everything about it. And then we're going to go on a tour. He's going to show us the bank. They have their own bank, the Caja Laboral, it's called. They have their own bank. They have research laboratories. We saw those. And they have, in the town of Mondragon, a huge factory. Looks like about I'm not exaggerating, 2 football fields, but with a kind of cavern, a little bit like an airplane hangar structure over these 2 football fields with immense assembly lines. And this is the, I don't know how you pronounce this in Spanish, F-A-G-O-R, anyone help me? Fajor or Fagor, I don't know what it is. They make washing machines. So this is a factory in Mondragon, has about 2,000, a little over 2,000 workers who manufacture washing machines of various kinds, and we were taken on a tour all through them. The factory is spotless. The machinery gleams, super high tech. I learned things about how to make washing machines, which if you're interested, I'll be glad to tell you about later. But the first thing to understand is you're in the presence of a very self-confident, highly polished operation that knows what it's doing, is very clear about that, very proud of what it has, and there's an easy camaraderie, which I'm not used to at all, between the man who's taking us around, who has some highfalutin title, Director of Communications, and the receptionist, who refer to each other by their first names. I know enough Spanish to get that. And the interaction between this gentleman and the people on the assembly line is the same sort. Very remarkable. And I was looking to see whether that was true, and that was really quite remarkable. Business done by, for those of you that pay attention to this, business done by the Mondragon Corporation. Total assets, now a little bit over $40 billion. So you're talking about one large company, 30 million euros. So something on the order of $40 billion. And that's its sales. So you have $40 billion worth of business done. You have 85,000 members, another 15,000 employees. They have expanded. They have opened operations in many other countries. How many? At the end of 2010, 77 enterprises outside of Spain are operated by the Mondragon Corporation, including, I believe, 5 here in the United States. But in many other countries, including China, India, and many other countries. 62% of their industrial sales are outside of Spain. The retail operations, of which the largest is this supermarket chain, employs 42,000 workers. Roughly half of the membership of this thing works in retail. All kinds of retail, but above all in this chain of supermarkets. The name is, if you ever go to Spain, Eroski, E-R-O-S-K-I, is the name of their supermarket chain that they run. In the Mondragon University, they have a complete university. One of the people I spent time with on that day is a professor at the university, a professor of business administration, because that's what they need to teach people, how to run their own. That's what most of the curriculum is. How do you start and how do you operate a cooperative business along the lines that they've developed, which they believe work. And they cycle through endless numbers of people who turn out not just to be Spanish, but come from all over Europe. They even have to have language classes to help handle the multi-language problem that Europe has, to train people. They cannot accommodate all those who want to come and get qualified in running these businesses. 3,400 students scattered on 4 campuses. I spent a good bit of time with a professor who turns out to have been an American. I think they put him with me because we could speak a language that saved us a lot of time. The other people we spoke with there all spoke English perfectly well, but nonetheless it wasn't, things go slower when you have to struggle with the language. He got his degree, I believe I learned, from Cornell, or comes out of the Cornell school. He married a Basque. He was in college. Some teacher told him about Mondragon. He forgot all about it. Then when he graduated, didn't know what to do with himself. That happens to 1 or 2 people in the world. And so he decided to go back and look at this Mondragon that he remembered the teacher talking about. and he couldn't get over it. He figured out a way to go back there. He met a young woman. They got married. They have several children. He's now a professor at the Mondragon University, teaching business administration and doing research on this institution. So it is a visually stunning operation. When you stand on the side of the hill in this reception direction building, the administration building that we were in, you can look down into the valley, and the gentleman very proudly pointed, every major building you saw in the city that was at the base of the valley is part of Mondragon. They are obviously, you know, the city of Mondragon is theirs. So here was the factory that made the washing machines. Here are the research labs on the side. Here's the headquarters of the Caja Laboral, their bank, and so on. It's all them. They have become the economic center of this city, which means that this is a city whose people, in terms of their urban life, their cultural life, their interpersonal relationships, are like a living laboratory for what the consequences are in society when your work is organized in this radically different way. Very, very interesting to hear. All across the hills are these things that look like condo projects, you know, these houses that are built on the side of the hill that look very similar to one another, but are little condo units. And those are, of course, built by the Mondragon for the use of their members and for the public. Let me turn now to tell you a little bit how they run their business, since after all, that's kind of crucial to all of this. Okay, the single most important decision-making body is called the General Assembly in each co-op. Each co-op enterprise works as its own enterprise. They produce something, they have to work that out, it's them. They have a meeting once a year of all of the members. In most enterprises, that's all the people there are. In some enterprises, as I mentioned before, there are members, but there are also employees. The meetings of the General Assembly are only for members. So in a co-op where there are both kinds, the employees don't come to the annual general meeting, just the members. But in most of the co-ops, that's all there is members, and they come to the meeting. At the annual general meeting,
is this of each co-op?
Each co-op.
So is it one general membership meeting?
No. Each enterprise. So for example, the 2,000 workers that make those Fagor washing machines, they have a general meeting, and they deal with the problems of their enterprise. You'll see in a minute how the coordination happens. So what is the decision they make in that meeting? One, they make the decision whether to hire, or if they already have one, whether to keep the general manager. The general manager would be the equivalent in capitalism of the CEO, the chief executive officer who sits on top. Below the general manager are department managers. They divide the business up into different departments. Each of those has a manager. The General Assembly hires and pays the general manager and the department managers, so that hiring and firing is reversed. Instead of the manager hiring and firing the workers, it's exactly the opposite. Okay? In preparation for each year's general meeting, General Assembly, all workers are required, this is not voluntary, to attend a whole series of meetings where they are provided with all of the information that they must have. How well the general manager performed, evaluations of the general manager and the departmental manager, all statistics having to do with money. Are they doing well? Are they doing badly? Have they lost money? Have they gained money? Everything that would be necessary to make an informed decision is provided to people in preparatory meetings, which are done on paid time. This is not an extra meeting you go to. All workers are paid as a regular part of their work to stop making washing machines and to go to these preparatory meetings where they are given all the information. What else do? They supervise the general manager and the department. If they don't like what they're doing, it has to be changed. They have debates and discussions on how the general manager and the particular manager should behave differently. Try to think about this. Try to get your hand around what we're doing here. Try to apply it to your own place of work. At least it's a delicious fantasy. If you're the kind of person who can imagine buying a lottery ticket, which is just a fantasy, then this is another kind of fantasy. It's probably more satisfying if you think about it. Let's continue. They decide the basic directions, the basic questions of directing the enterprise. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to give you some examples. They decide whether the enterprise moves. For example, if it's growing, it may need more space. Is it going to expand where it is, or build a branch, or move to another town, or move, for that matter, to another country? That decision is made by the General Assembly, nobody else. That's discussed, debated, voted. Majority vote, end of decision. So, where to produce? Second, how to produce? What technology to use? What technology are we going to use? This kind of machine, that kind of machine, what? And there I had long conversation because I was very interested in this, and I think you might be interested. I asked, well, do you buy inputs, like machines, from other members of the Mondragon family? In other words, do you encourage that? It was as if I had insulted his mother. No, he looked at me with great intensity. Absolutely not. He could see I had touched some kind of nerve. We have a rule. Every co-op must go out, get bidding, and get the best machine at the lowest price. If it's a co-op, great. If it isn't a co-op, great. And then an hour later, when he took me through the washing machine factory, he showed me he remembered this, it was very important to him. He showed me on the sign of this enormous machine that, by the way, interesting in case some of you know about this, it takes the metal frame of a washing machine that has to be painted because it's steel, it's stainless steel, and it has to have layers of paint because the machine wobble, you know what washing machines do, and the paint on it is going to be messed up if you don't really make the paint adhere. And the way they do that is they put a tremendous positive charge on the metal frame and a tremendous negative charge in a liquid bath of a certain kind of paint. Then they dip the metal frame into that bath, and it's the coming together of electric charges that are tremendous that literally clamp, and they do it 3 times, clamp 3 layers of paint onto that metal frame. That machine, it's all computer coordinated. Very little work is done except by the people who are sitting up above looking at these multiple screen consoles that are watching the computer that actually measures everything. This machine is German, which, by the way, is the story of Europe these days. The German machines are everywhere. The German machines are the best machine to do this. So they have German machines, and that was the dominant technology in this entire factory. It wasn't the only kind, but the Germans were very clearly there. And that means whenever anything goes wrong, the Germans have to come quickly from Germany to fix it if the local people can't, and so forth. They make the rules of how co-ops function. This may be the thing that interests you most. I'm going to just give you some examples, partly because I'm still learning myself, and so there are things I don't know, but I think I can give you a flavor. The range of pay, one of the things they're most proud of. Early on, the various General Assemblies got together and worked out that they needed to make themselves different from other co-op movements. They needed to organize and institutionalize lots of coordination among the co-ops. In the history of co-ops, that's been a very serious problem. When co-ops try to go it alone for all kinds of reasons, the general history is they have a hard time. They really need to clump together and help each other, but they found that very difficult to organize. And so that's their way of viewing it, and so they're very big on that. So here's one of the rules. Out of the net revenue of every co-op, net revenue is a difference between the money they get in from selling what they produce and the basic costs of producing it. So, what you might call the gross profit in some sense. 10% of the gross profit is immediately withdrawn from every enterprise and put into a common fund to sustain the administration that coordinates among them all. So each of them has to finance their coordination with one another. That's very basic, and he stressed that to me over and over again. That's the first 10%. 45% of the net revenue of every enterprise is left for the enterprise itself to expand its production, to get new machines, to do what it needs to build their co-op. So that leaves another 45%. What is the third 45%? After the 10% to organize the coordination and the 45% to develop the co-op enterprise, the last 45% is really interesting. The last 45% of the net revenue is to be distributed to all the members. So this is a very generous profit sharing. In the history of profit sharing, that's a stunning amount of money to be shared out. But then, having explained that to you, then they smile and they say, but the worker doesn't get it. And you go, huh? And here's what they've worked out. The worker is credited, a record is kept, is credited with his or her share of the 45% net revenue. And that is put into a fund which accumulates over the years that the worker works there, and that's the basis of the pension when you retire. You basically, your pension is the share of the 45% that goes for that purpose in every enterprise. Which means all of the pensioners of Mondragon are jealously looked at by everybody else in Spain because they get the Social Security that everybody in Spain gets, and on top of it, they get their share of the profits of the co-ops in which they worked according to the number of years that they worked there. But to sweeten it, they have a further arrangement. What you do get at the end of the year is a little bonus. And the bonus is 7% of whatever you've accumulated towards your pension to that year. You don't get the 45% that's your share of the profit. You get 7% as a bonus on whatever you've accumulated over however many years of your share that's building to your pension. So in a sense, the 45% you get partly when you retire and partly in an interest rate now. And 7% at a time when global interest rates are like 1 and 2 is a very nice thing indeed. But he stressed to me that because we don't give it to the workers, this 45% is an immense fund for us to use to develop the Mondragons. That's where the money comes from to set up a university. That's where the money comes from to set up a research center and all the rest. So that's how, all those decisions were made by the General Assembly and can be changed at any time by the General Assembly. Range of pay, very proud. In most enterprises, by the way, each enterprise can set these rules itself, but there's so much peer pressure, you could tell the way he said it, there's a rule. In most of the co-op enterprises, the highest paid person is not allowed to get more than 4.5 times what the lowest paid person does. There are some exceptions, including that a washing machine factory, it turns out, where the gap is allowed to go to 6.5%, 6.5 times. For those of you that are not familiar, in the United States today, the order is something of 300 or 400 times. So what you have here is a fantastic compression of income and wealth inequality. And you see it everywhere. You just see it everywhere. There's a kind of comfort. You know, everybody has, you can see. I looked, I saw no beggars. I saw nobody panhandling on the street. Now, I wasn't there very long. I could have missed it. But you just got this sense of people, everybody having not a lot of wealth, but everybody being pretty comfortable, being okay. Everybody seemed pretty okay. And I asked that question to him and to several others, and I was told yes. We could never have survived if we didn't do that. That's a condition of the survival of this co-op that we're kind of all in it together. And if we allow, he looked at me, if we allowed the kinds of differences that you take as for granted in your capital, by the way, they said this freely. In their language, which I take to be excruciatingly important, in their language, they distinguished, and this was some of the people on the line too, they distinguished between what we're doing and the alternative as capitalist. That was the word they used. So they're comfortable with that dichotomy. They did not feel the need. By the way, in the United States, very different. You talk to people who do co-ops in the United States, they will go out of their way to try to explain to you that no, what we're doing is real capitalism, not that crappy thing that those big companies. This notion of breaking with capitalism is very hard in the United States for understandable reasons of our culture and our ideology. Much easier in Spain. For them, you could tell, for most of them, capitalism is sort of a sleazy business. And they're not, they're proud to say, we don't do that, and that's the end of that. It doesn't have a positive tone to them. So for those of you that are interested or come from places that people are interested, or you think of yourself as part of a movement that believes in democracy or equality or egalitarianism, this is a society that has made gigantic strides in that direction through the simple expedient of not allowing the job to be a source of inequality that is grotesque and enormous by simple fiat. That we will not do that, end of it. That's been a rule, and he said to me he cannot imagine that changes in any significant way ever. He said it'll oscillate, he said, between the 4.5 and the 6.5. Martin?
What's the floor like? What is the standard of living like for like an unskilled engineer?
I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know. Huh? Time, okay. Yeah, let me try to, I don't know. It's a good question, but I don't really know. Some other things just to help you think about this. There is a rigid rule, no competition among co-ops. So he said to us, once there's a co-op in a particular line of work, no other one can go. We do not want co-ops competing against one another. You can buy the output, one co-op can buy the output of another as an input, or they can share things, that's fine. But no head-to-head competition. That was a rule. I did not understand, and I asked, and he didn't understand me. I didn't understand quite why that was so important, but it clearly was. Very important. Perhaps the most important thing that in the area of the decision. The General Assemblies have decided, and of course this is interesting because it's what workers would do, that more important than anything else is the job. You know, when you think about it, it's of course obvious, but we're an American, or I'm an American, and so this isn't obvious to me. The first thing that's important to the corporations that I've worked with all my life is not jobs. The clever capitalist is the one who gets rid of jobs. Don't worry about jobs, he gets rid of them. If you can save 3 jobs, 3 positions, you don't need any more, you're a genius for efficiency. You got rid of those people. That's not their mentality. So for them, they're terribly proud, and they give you then as many stories as you have the time to stand listening to about how they manage. By the way, for those of you interested in economic planning and for the experience of the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe or China or Cuba or any place like that, listen to what I'm telling you because they've solved that problem. When there is, they said to me, when there is no more social need for a certain kind of work at the extent that it used to be. And he immediately gave me an example. We've been terribly affected by the global capitalist crisis. We've lost a lot of our markets. So we had 2,500 people making washing machines. We now have, the number's 1,800 or something. A big chunk of those workers, there was no point in making these machines. They couldn't sell them. There was no market for them. And he said, that's a big problem. And how you handle that, we've worked out as follows. We have an elaborate system. It's fascinating to listen to. We have an elaborate point system. Every worker in every co-op is assessed a certain number of points. It depends on how old you are, what skills you have. Do you come from a big family or a little family? Are you low in the income pattern or are you high in it? Have you had this skill? Have you worked these many years? It's an immense array of qualifications. And that gives you a point number. And when you get a point number, then if there has to be, if there's redundancy, if there's too many workers in a particular area, you got to get rid of 500. The only question is, what is the menu of options you give to each worker. And which menu you get depends on your points. Whether you've worked a long time, you get a little bit better menu than if you didn't, and so forth. So here's the proud result. Whenever we've had to cut back, and he used the example of the washing machine folks that were redundant over the last 2 years, he said, we have either put them on pension. If they're older workers, we said, okay, you can go on pension earlier. Or we have, this is the crucial part, moved them to other co-ops, which we have the right to do. We go to a person, we say, okay, there's no more need for washing machines, but we have these 27 enterprises that need people. But there's a problem. They're 14 miles away, or they're 80 miles away. Okay, the co-op then, giving you an option, you have a choice, also helps you by providing the cost of the commuting is picked up by the co-ops in general to facilitate. And if you go to a place that's even further away, not only will you get the money to commute, but you'll get some extra points for your status because you've kind of taken a hardship position by going a little bit further than the next worker. He says in that way, we have not had to lay anyone off for years. Now, I don't know the details beyond that, but that's how they solved it. You know, a standard criticism of planning in the Soviet Union was they were so committed to giving everybody a job that there were all these people who were not necessary and were not working, and therefore it was unprofitable. That always struck me as a crazy, what's that about? It's just simple. Take people away from the jobs where we don't need them and put them in the place. That's what socialist planning ought to be. What's best for the community, move people. How hard is that? Right? And that's basically what they've done. They've worked that system out, and they're extremely proud. And more times, the workers, when we stopped on the line and we spoke to them, there were two people beside me, and one of them spoke Spanish, so he worked for me. I don't speak Spanish, so he was my kind of translator. And the people we spoke to on the line, we got over and over again, clearly, the number one thing for them, that you have a job. If something happens, they take care of you here. They take, that Wolff's words, they take care of you. I, of course, got nervous. What's the they? Shouldn't you be saying we? But when I listened, that's what they meant. They meant the co-op as a whole. And that's why they don't begrudge the 10% taken from the profits of every one of them, because that's part of what pays for all the coordination. That means they really have job security. And since they can read every day in the newspapers in Spain, I don't know if you're aware of it, right? Spain is now kind of Greece all over again. The unemployment, the official unemployment rate in Spain now is about 25%. For people under 25 years of age, it's roughly half are unemployed. So everyone in Spain knows how terrible it is. To be part of an enterprise that is not suffering these kinds of numbers or anything like it is remarkable. It's the same when I did a little bit of work with the statistics of the Caja Laboral, the bank. I'll bring this to an end now. And here's what struck me. The bank has about 18 billion euros in deposits from its members, people who bank, their customers. And it has about 17 billion euros out in loans. Very rare in this day for a bank to not lend out more money than it gets in deposits. What most modern banks do, particularly all big ones in the United States, and for that matter in most of the other parts of the world, is they lend out everything their depositors, but then they borrow a lot of money and relend it at a higher rate. So they have a very conservative policy. It's a little bit like the story, for some of you know, that there's one bank in North Dakota here in the United States that is basically a government public bank, and they also have very rigid rules about not getting into the borrowing business, and they have done very well through the crisis compared to most other banks. So you have a little bit of very conservative notion. So let me wrap it up and summarize it. Biggest problem. How to deal with the 15 to 20,000 people who are employees. They're not members. They don't have all these rights. They don't have all these guarantees. I asked, why do you have them? He said, well, part of it is we don't want to make a person a member until it's like a probation period. They have to work here for a while, six months, a year, something. So they're happy with this system. We're happy with them, and then they become part of it. And I said, yeah, but I can see from the numbers that you've had them for longer than that. Yes, he says, particularly when we go out of Spain and we don't know the culture and it's different. And he began to tell us stories about the Chinese workers and the Indian workers. They don't know how to handle it. And the truth is they're having terrible debates and discussions because there are many people inside who feel this is the destruction of their enterprise. You're now recreating capital. They use these words, capitalist exploitation. We have the employer, us members, and the employee, and we don't take care of them, and we don't have the obligation. This is no good. And others who say, but what are we going to do? We can't just leap over the differences between us and the people in China or India, wherever they're going, who don't think like their stories, by the way, about China are really heartrending. Trying to explain, having meetings, trying to explain to the Chinese workers what this is. With the Chinese workers saying, what? This is the craziest idea they ever heard of. They want to be told who's in charge. They want to get they expect something, having to explain to the Chinese communist worker what it is you're trying to do it's an awkward moment, And they didn't smile. I mean, this is really hard for them, but they're very worried about all of this. They're very, very worried about it, and I think they ought to be. And the reason is, I'm going to remind you of something, and indeed. Ken Levin over there is the person I learned all this from, that we've had cooperative enterprises here in the United States. In fact, Silicon Valley is one of those places where lots of companies start with people who quit their jobs in a big computer and get together with a bunch of their friends with laptops or little computers in somebody's garage, and they set up a little collective enterprise, and they run it pretty much like this. And they're successful. And when they're successful, there's a moment when they start hiring people. And they're no longer the collection of young people who started a collective enterprise. They're now, and when that happens, they change. And they have a fight inside often between those who don't want to lose all that they had when they were a collective and were equal. And they're willing to forego growth to hold on to the arrangement. And others who know we want to grow, and they become then the employer. That struggle has ended many a cooperative enterprise that chose not to go that way. And so in a sense, they're having that struggle now. Now, they have a history that suggests they're going to come out okay on this, but they are struggling over it, and they may have to become smaller for a while and basically push those people away because they can't handle the difference inside between a member and a not member. Last thing I want to leave with you. Besides this extraordinary story of success and growth, and workers who look, sound, and in every way that I can tell, much, much more at home, comfortable, relaxed. The interaction between the upper and lower echelons, as far as I could tell, like nothing I've seen here. I've been in many job situations in this country. In a sense, I'm reminded, as I was there, of a remark Marx once made. Marx once said that the family, messed up as it is in capitalism, is nonetheless, in many ways, a haven in a heartless world. That the family and the household survive as institutions because they're a place to come back to from the rest of life outside. What is really interesting about Mondragon is that, in a sense, they're trying to make the enterprise that the enterprise is going to be, even more than your home, a place where you are taken seriously, where you really have some power, some stature, some position. You're not ranked with other people in a way that makes you feel small and little and insignificant. Everything is done to get out of that situation. It's extraordinary, and not just as a work idea, but as a real revolutionary way to think about yourself. And I was struck, and toward the end of the meeting I said, well, I come at this from Marxism, and I'm really fascinated by all of this. And he smiled, and I said, but I get the impression that you're not hooked into politics. And he smiled in that way of a person who kind of wants you to understand. He knows exactly what you're saying, but he's now going to tell you something you need to understand. He then explains to me that they are rigidly neutral politically. They do not endorse the communists or the socialists or the right-wingers or the conservatives, none of it. He says, we will have nothing to do with that stuff that they do in Madrid, in the capital. So he proudly said 2 weeks ago, the current minister, it's a very conservative government in Spain right now, the current minister of industry came up here and we had his helicopter land over here and we took him around, and he wants to use one of our models. It's going to be a model for all of Spain, and we worked that out, and that's fine. And when the socialists are in power and their minister comes, we do exactly the same thing. But he was saying to us, we are developing the alternative to capitalism. None of them are in that business. And so we don't hate them, we don't love them, but we're sure as hell not going to get involved in choosing among them, because that's not relevant to what we're doing. That's not their business. They're not interested in that. We're doing it. And we now are the dominant industry in this part of Spain. They're the #1 enterprise in the Basque region. Everybody has to deal with us. And there was that confidence again that I picked up all the way through. So the bottom line, here is a self-consciously non-capitalist, anti-capitalist alternative that has grown for 50 years and is a dramatic illustration that there is an alternative, contrary to Mrs. Thatcher, who wanted us to believe there is no alternative. There is one. It isn't all that far away. And not only are they well organized, and not only do you just go to Mondragon-Corporation.com and you can get them on the internet, but they have an elaborate, many-language system of greeting you and giving you a tour. Any of you can go, and I would, if you're ever in that part of the world, it's very pretty, it's very nice, and I would urge you to go, because seeing it in a concrete, on-the-spot way has these advantages that reading about it just cannot accomplish. And for those of us that are becoming more interested in alternatives to capitalism as capitalism everywhere falls apart, this is something for us to pay a lot of attention to. Sorry to have kept you so long. Thank you very much for coming. And